Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Not Tuesday show. My name is James Chen, and I've been wanting to do a stream like this for a while. I've got a very special guest here. Look, Rollback obviously is such a big conversation within the FGC and such, and even though I think for the most part, most people have gotten to understanding that rollback is the best way for us to go, I still feel like there's this weird mystery kind of surrounding rollback and a lot of misinformation still going on. So I am very grateful to have Zinac here join us for this episode. I'm going to go ahead and just bring him on over here. So everybody say hello to Zinac. And yeah, he is a big expert in rollback netcode, but I'll let you talk about it. Who are you and why should we believe anything you say about rollback netcode?
Happy to be here, James. I'm glad that you are calling me an expert. I don't really think of myself as that, but I guess when it comes to rollbacks, I'm one of the few people who've actually shipped games using it, so I'm good as anyone, I guess. Yeah, I've been working in games for about 10 years now professionally. Started out developing indie fighting games. As you probably know, a lot of people know, I worked on a version of Skullgirls back in the day when it was like a college project between a bunch of people on like SRK and such. I had my own fighting game, still kind of in development though, called Fearless Knight. My whole thing was that I wanted to like develop a game from scratch that did support rollbacks. That's been going on for good almost 10 years now. But at some point, I was talking to my buddy Keats, and he's like, "Hey, we have this project going on over at Iron Galaxy you might be interested in." And turns out that was Killer Instinct, and they brought me on as a game designer there. So worked very closely.
I was prepared. Yeah. I was prepared.
Yeah. So as you know, that game had rollbacks, and I really got to cut my teeth as a designer for a game that did have rollbacks in mind from the very beginning. So that was a very formative experience. I transitioned to more technical design there, doing a lot more programming, and continued working on my own project. Eventually, once Killer Instinct got finished up, the project kind of ended. I moved out to Japan, worked for ArcSys as around 2017 as the gameplay programmer, battle programmer on Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. Worked on that for a few years and eventually transitioned to implementing the rollbacks in Guilty Gear Strive with a great team that made that happen in a very short amount of time. And now I'm off doing more independent stuff, but hopefully I get to work on fighting games in the future. Right now, I'm taking a short break on that, but that's pretty much my history.
Dang. So, I mean, like, I have all these questions, but now you're just talking about, like, your time at ArcSys, and now I just want to be like, ooh, what happened? Dude, tell me all the secrets of ArcSys.
But maybe 10 years, so I'll tell you.
Fair enough. But, look, obviously, for those people watching this and aren't familiar with exactly what rollback is, I mean, if you're watching this video, you have no idea what the rollback is. I'm very confused right now because I feel like those two areas completely intersect here. But do you have a quick way to describe exactly what rollback netcode is and why it's so good for fighting games?
Okay, yeah, I've explained this a lot, so I think I can do it in pretty precise manner. Before you understand rollbacks, really, you have to understand how fighting game networking works at all. From the very beginning, ever since there's been networked fighting games, it basically uses the same basic strategy that even delay-based netcode uses. Some people even say it is delay-based netcode, right? Rollback netcode is delay-based netcode. But just a quick shortcut explaining that is, before we had rollbacks, pretty much the way you made network fighting games work is you just sent input from both players to each other over the network. And as long as you played the same inputs on both sides, you would get the same result on computers, right? Both consoles. That's just how computers work. If you didn't get the same results for every instruction every time, computers wouldn't be very useful, right? So that's how programs work. And to compensate for the time it takes to send information over the internet, we have to add delay to the input,
Right.
right? So that input is used at the same time on both computers. Now, what rollback does is it kind of lets you get rid of this delay on your own end, right? Instead of sending the input and waiting to play the input on your local computer at the same time as your opponent's computer, you actually play it immediately, right? That same frame. So you don't have the feeling of delay, right? You know, everybody knows it feels terrible. If you ever played 6, 7 frames of delay across
Yes.
the continent, you know, it's awful. So what the strategy is to basically play it immediately. And once you eventually do get the input from the other player, you basically roll the game state back invisibly. You don't see this at all. Then rerun the game for X number of frames, basically to compensate for the network latency, the same number of frames it would have taken for that input to get to the other side. And the game corrects itself, right? You don't actually ever see the game go back to a previous state. You just see the correction.
Right.
And that's the short of it. This means it works for anything that runs on a computer. It doesn't have to be a fighting game. But even like Overwatch, other network games use this strategy. Now, the rollback happens on server end, but it's the same thing.
Oh, interesting. So, yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a question that I just kind of realized now. One of the reasons why obviously rollback netcode and everything like that is so important is because fighting games are peer to peer, right? And you know, a lot of other games like League of Legends and Overwatch are, you know, the clients contacting the server. So, but that's interesting. I always thought because of that, because there's that server state, that rollback isn't particularly as useful for server-based games like that. But can rollback be applied to games like League of Legends and Overwatch? And are they actually being used by some of the more popular esports out there?
You know, I can't speak specifically of any particular game, but I know some do employ rollbacks so they can compensate for the network latency, right? Otherwise, it would add even more lag. You know, if a server had to wait for all the input from all the players to come in, you know, you would basically incur the longest time from any particular client, right? You'd incur that penalty, and then the server would have to run the game locally with all those inputs, and then finally would send it. But if you can just kind of roll things back at any time and rerun the game from a few frames ago, then you can like reduce the amount of apparent latency that way. So
Okay.
I haven't worked on too many server-based games, so don't hold me to that. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But look, I mean, I hate to start start some of the questions this way, but you know, I want to talk about Street Fighter V because obviously, Street Fighter V came out. It was one of the first mainstream Japanese-based rollback games, and obviously, when rollback is implemented very well, which we have seen in a lot of games since then, rollback is absolutely fantastic. But what we saw from Street Fighter V was that the rollback wasn't particularly good, and you know, the snapping of the state just made it so it looked like you were like things were jumping around because it was basically always correcting itself. And so my question is, you know, as a person who's worked on rollback, I even feel like I kind of remember Mike Z even saying when he saw that happening, he knew exactly what the bug was. I mean, was it pretty clear what the mistake was that they made? And do you have like a kind of like a easy way to describe what they were doing wrong?
Right. Okay. So if you had talked to anybody who'd worked on rollbacks online, they would have said the same thing, right? It's probably time synchronization. This was happening. So-called Rift. If you ever talk to the canons, they refer to as the Rift, but it's really what's happening is when each computer is running the game, what frame it's currently processing gets slightly out of sync with the other one, right? So I might be on the 10th frame of the game, but you're only on the 5th frame of the game. So I'm way ahead of you, which means I have to wait even longer to get your 10th frame input, right? So it's going to take longer. I'm going to be much farther ahead. That means I have to roll back even farther compared to what you're doing, right? You're behind me in this case. So you're getting my inputs right on time. So you're not seeing these crazy corrections. So you get an advantage in that way. So if you don't compensate for the drifting, you're going to incur more rollbacks on one side than the other. The reason this happen is because, especially on PC, right, performance is going to vary between different computers. This is probably why a lot of people saw it more often on PC or between PC and console than between console and console. It's easy to compensate for, but you have to be aware of it.
Okay, so actually, the person who has the better machine is the one that's going to see the rollback more often, right?
Right. Generally, that's the case. Yeah.
Okay, so at some point in time, I mean, everyone remembers the life of the Altimore patch for like maybe 2 days or
Right.
3 days or something like that. But as far as you can tell, was the fix from Altimore pretty substantial, or was there a potential for still other bugs potentially in that? So in other words, if Capcom was like, hey, let's take this patch and let's roll it out to both PCs and consoles, like, would that actually have improved it for the most part and fixed most of the problems?
Well, I mean, you can't just roll the patch into the console version. It's completely different compiler and things like that. So the technique for fixing it isn't difficult at all. So as long as if they're willing to like go out and talk to anybody who's worked on rollbacks, they could have explained to them very quickly. Now, the actual cause of their clock or time desynchronization, their drifting, it could be many things, right? It may have just been a small bug in their code, right, that wasn't caught during development, and the person may have been off the project by the time the game got released, who understood this stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you could speculate about it, but ultimately, you don't need to have a complicated patch to make it work. It's a very simple algorithm. It's used by pretty much every PC on the planet for synchronizing clocks between different systems. Otherwise, the time on your computer versus the time on another computer would be off, right? These kind of things are used. It's common. So I don't know. It's kind of frustrating that I understand why they're not aware of it. There's not a lot of Japanese documentation on rollbacks, right? There's not a lot of tutorials and videos because you pretty much need to be part of the English-speaking internet to get access to this stuff. So I think I can understand why that happened, but I think now we're now in an era of games implementing rollbacks correctly. Suddenly there's a huge number of them. So I don't think we're going to have that problem again. Crossing my fingers. I'm looking forward to Fire 6.
I mean, again, might be a question that you don't even have to answer because this might be one of those NDA things. But you said you did work on Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. Did you push for rollback in that area? For that game.
So I always let it be known that I could do it. I'll put it that way. So
okay,
yeah, and that's kind of how it led to Strive. So.
Nice. And how much? I mean, I don't have to answer this, but how much of those polls that were taken at all the events? I've been crediting Arxis a lot with actually listening to those polls and everybody saying, please put rollback in there. And obviously Strive started with delay-based netcode. The very first beta had delay-based netcode. But how much of a factor were those polls from the users asking to put rollback into Strive?
Well, as far as I understand, I wasn't part a lot of those discussions. I was just asked whether or not it was technically possible to do it. So there was a lot of discussions internally, as far as I'm aware, and I think there's some awareness of people obviously wanting it, right? I think that's clear. But I think for a long time internally, people wanted to implement it, and now I think it just got an excuse to be able to do it for that project. So, which was awesome because finally, Japanese fighting games have rollback now, almost all of them now. So it's awesome. Even older ones are going back and adding it, which is fantastic. Yeah.
I mean, Strive's rollback is kind of infamous now for being like one of the best rollback that's existed in a mainstream Japanese game. And this is, again, I think I've done this to you before, but I'm going to give the opportunity to take a lot of credit for that. No, but how much of that was you making sure that the rollback worked so well for Strive?
To be honest, the rollback network part of it is not very difficult. Okay. All the difficulty comes in modifying the gameplay code, optimizing the game, fixing all the various bugs that can happen with, resynchronizations or, the fix-up that needs to happen after a rollback. That required a team of people, right? It required several programmers who were very familiar with the code base already, I wasn't as familiar with this drive code base, so I had to rely on them to go and pretty much say, hey, this is what we need to do. Like when it comes to the sound, this kind of bug could happen. If you play Street Fighter Cross Tekken, you've seen the sound bug, you've heard the sound bug, right?
Yeah.
It can happen in rollbacks. Even AC Remix, those kind of games often had that.
I
Same
think
thing with optimization. So
yeah, I've heard it in KOF 15 before too. KOF 15 has some of those audio bugs where like you'll hit somebody and they'll do their death scream, but then they're okay, you know.
bigger problem is repeating the same sound over and over again every frame, right? That is a big problem that can happen in a lot of those. They eventually fixed it for Street Fighter Cross Tekken, as far as I recall, but eventually a lot of people complained about that very early on.
Well,
Yeah.
so I mean, you kind of kind of got into the next question that I was talking about that I kind of wanted to know. So in case people don't understand how like some one of the technical sides of rollback, and again, correct me if I say anything incorrect here, but a lot of rollback is kind of saving the state of the game, right?
Yeah.
And so that way, when you know you're synced, the last moment that you know you're truly synced, that's like a save state, and then from there, every once in a while it can play out the inputs and check to make sure that it keeps going there. Now, for older games, and especially for things like Fightcade and such, like save state is kind of easier because like the games are really small, right? So if you have a smaller game, you can literally like save the entire state of the game and play it back from there. Is that basically what a lot of like Fightcade is doing?
Right. Like the CPS2, I think had something like a megabyte of memory. So you can save that really quickly. It includes all the video state, right? Everything, audio. So you can easily save that off and restore it pretty much instantly, right? Modern games have much larger memory they need to use. So you need to be careful about which memory contributes to your game's behavior, right? You want to keep that as small as possible. And then also have you a bunch of handles and things like 3D models, animation, right? Special effects, audio. Those things also need to be carefully handled and kind of separately from the game state itself in modern engines, because modern 3D engines like Unreal and Unity are very complicated things. They're multi-threaded. They have a lot of different optimization strategies you need to account for. So
So,
that's
so
the big difference.
so basically, like if I have this straight, then like obviously for retrofitting stuff into older games, you're just like boom, save the entire state of the game, play back from there, everything's hunky dory, and it just recalculates based on the new inputs. But for modern games, you're not actually saving the entire state of the game, right? Is it kind of simulating a save state by just trying to remember what you basically pick exactly what you're trying to save? Or is there some form of actually saving the entire state of the game?
So luckily, fighting games tend not to be very complicated when it comes to just the number of variables are used into processing the game. So you can really easily just copy everything that contributes to the behavior, like what's the current frame in an action, right? What is the position of the characters, things like that. Most 2D or one-on-one fighting games, any one-on-one fighting game, even a four-player fighting game, doesn't have a lot of memory you need to actually copy over. Compared to something like an open world game, right? That has many, many dozens of actors, objects running around doing their own thing. So as long as you're careful and you kind of isolate all the variables that contribute to the behavior of your game separately, from the rest of the rendering stuff, the UI, all that kind of stuff, you can easily just copy that and recopy it back. The trouble is you're a programmer, right? You have pointers, handles into memory, right? And once you restore a game state, you don't want to have a pointer that's necessarily pointing to like invalid memory that's now different, right? So that's all the difficulty that you have to consider when you implement rollbacks into an existing game. If you do it from the beginning, you can kind of be careful and just have it kind of work from the beginning. But if you're retrofitting rollbacks, it can be really difficult depending on complexity of the game. So.
Okay. So, I mean, for something like Dragon Ball Fighters, I got to imagine trying to put rollback into that game is going to be a pretty monumental task, huh?
This game's a little more complicated than a typical ArcSys game because of the additional characters and the tags and stuff, but it's definitely doable.
Okay. And then, you were talking about, you can kind of save the state. So, like, one of the things that I was thinking about, like, I remember in Killer Instinct, I think it was, it might have been Hisako or something, but like, even in training mode, when you reset the stage, like the flame would actually, like, where it was, it'll kind of like drift back into the neutral state and stuff like that.
Right.
I was thinking for even a game like Street Fighter, like let's say Manat activates the V trigger orbs and she's got now 6 orbs over here, which you could launch all at the same time and go in all these different directions again.
Right.
Like, so for rollback, then you're saying it's actually not that difficult to store all that kind of like as a giant encompassing state. Like you don't have to
Yeah.
manually choose everything that you have to keep track of.
No, you'd only have to ever manually choose things if your game had an enormous number of objects. I think on games I've worked on in the past, I won't say specifically which ones, I think we could easily store off 100 objects in one rollback. So you're never going to have more than that in most fighting games, right? So,
Okay.
and that's on the PS4. Modern consoles are going to be able to handle even more, So
So, I
yeah,
mean,
it's not really a problem.
one of the things that I've heard, in the past from people saying, oh, one of the things that can be difficult with rollback netcode is, camera positions, lighting effects, like you said, the audio situation, making sure you cut off audio or accidentally play it back and stuff. And, how difficult is that to handle? Is that like kind of outside of the save state stuff, or is that just kind of built into it?
So I put these class of problems not as the actual, how do you put it? As long as you've like designed your game where basically you can restore the state at any point and it remains a pleasant experience, it's not gonna be an issue. So if you try to write your UI, it's very tied into the actual gameplay code. You're gonna have a problem because you're gonna restore the UI state, and you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
see like pops and stuff in the actual HUD and such. But if you're clever, right, you kind of make it independent, and the UI updates based on the gameplay, but not directly reads variables to update the current visual state, then you're gonna be okay. Same with audio. It's gonna be same with the camera. A basic thing I do in a lot of the games I work on is I don't tie the camera directly to the gameplay camera, right? Gameplay camera handles things like where the characters can go. Can they go left or right? Can they move any farther left, right? That's independent of what you're actually seeing and what's rendering. So you can easily have the camera not directly tied, but it will read the current position, and you can blend, right, and make the experience smoother for the player. And because most rollbacks, we're talking about a few frames, right? 3 to like 8 frames maximum.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start blending those values together over time, it's not going to be as noticeable to players. There's so many things you can do to compensate for the correction that happens.
Okay. And yeah, I mean that's probably also an important thing to, for those people who aren't as familiar with rollback and the technical side of things that, a lot of the rollbacks that occurs can be like milliseconds and like literally visually you can't really see it, so it shouldn't be jumping like Street Fighter 5's on particularly bad matchups, right? It's going to be pretty subtle cuz the rollback happens so quickly, right?
We're very lucky in fighting games where we have attacks that have a fixed amount of time they run, right? It's not like a first-person shooter where you can run around and shoot while you're moving. You're not constantly giving new inputs that change the state of the game. There's always a delay that happens locally. When you press a button, attack comes out, minimum maybe 4 frames, 8 frames. And the longer it is, the more the network latency it can compensate for, right? Because effectively the game doesn't need to roll back unless the state would have been different.
Right.
And if you do like Ryu standing fierce, I don't know how many frames that is in the current game, 10 frames or something? That's more than enough time for your input to get the other player. And so that startup time is actually hiding the latency.
Right. I see. I see. So in other words, even if there is a little bit of a desync, the startup will kind of cover the fact of when it was supposed to hit the opponent, right?
Oh, it just prevents it prevents you from changing the state of the game, right? Your
Hmm.
inputs won't have any effect on what changed in those cases. Same thing with like
Okay.
hit stop. Our games tend to have tons of hit stop. So when you hit an opponent, there's basically the game will freeze, or the two characters that are interacting will freeze for a fixed amount of time. And that also hides any latency. Like while that's happening, you can input something. That input arrives at your opponent's computer, Well, the freeze is still happening. And if you say you want to do a special cancel from a standing normal attack, well, it's fine. You don't see any corrections because the input arrived in time. So,
Interesting. So
so
in other
fighting games are
words,
great rollbacks, yeah.
fighting games, I mean, really just lend themselves to rollback particularly well then, huh?
They do. They absolutely do.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, we've kind of touched on this a little bit. We started kind of going in this direction. One of the biggest things that I hear about rollback all the time is that for 3D games like Tekken, like Soul Calibur, that rollback is much harder to implement for those games than it is for 2.5D games like Strive. Obviously, it's still rendered in 3D engine, but we don't have the 3D movement. And from my standpoint, from a programmer standpoint, I can't really figure out why that is the case, and like part of me doesn't want to believe that that's actually true. But so from your experience, I don't know if you've even had a chance to work on like a 3D game with 3D movement like that for rollback, but how much truth is there to that statement that it's harder for 3D games?
I'm not going to say it's harder for 3D games in particular, because one of the few things I think would have been difficult in implementing rollbacks in like Virtua Fighter and one of those kind of 3D fighters is they do tie collision volumes to bones, right? The animation drives things. But we had that in Killer Instinct as well.
Oh,
so
okay.
there are techniques to deal with it. And I believe NetherRealm games also do that.
That's
so
true. I think so. Yeah.
It's definitely possible. And honestly, like the Mortal Kombat games have a lot in similar with 3D games if you look how they actually handle combat. So yeah, I mean, there's no physical laws that say 3D games are somehow unable to have rollbacks, right? The same principles apply to all video games, right? And the same things I just mentioned before about how animations do have startup time. You have hit stop. You have all these things to hide latency. Those exist in all fighting games. So yeah, there may be a particular implementation of fighting games that are harder to implement rollback in just because you didn't consider it from the beginning. But if you start a brand new game considering you're going to have rollbacks, there's so many things you can do to make your life much easier.
So in other words, if you're planning for it from the beginning, so let's say Bandai Namco is like, we're putting rollback in Tekken 8, there really shouldn't be any increased difficulty dealing with rollback net code and the logic behind the resetting the states and everything and correcting things as compared to Strive or even Street Fighter 6 or even Mortal Kombat 11, right?
Let's put it this way: the statement that 2D fighting games are somehow easier to do it than 3D games is not really a statement that tracks for me. It all comes to how the game's already been implemented. The legacy code that you're taking, you've probably dealt with legacy code yourself, having to learn how that works, and how to implement a feature. There are many talented engineers out in the world, and I think if they understand these principles and concepts of how to deal with rollbacks, they could take on any game and make it possible. No.
Nice. Okay. See, thank you, validating my thought here. Because again, I just. Oh, go ahead. Oh no. Yeah. I mean, just thinking about like the whole situation, because Strive and all those, like, I understood when the argument was between sprite based games and 3D based games. Maybe I feel like that there could be something here. And actually, while you're here, is there any extra difficulties even in that factor from being a sprite based game to a 3D model based game? Obviously, it's easier for older games just because they take up less memory. But let's just say we're playing a game with just like the most ridiculously ginormous sprites in the entire world that take up gobs of memory. Would there be any significant difference between a sprite-based game or a 3D game?
Well, the big difference between the sprite-based game and modern 3D games is the image you show on screen in a 2D sprite-based game is pretty much just an index into a list of images, right? As long as you set that index, it's just an index into an array, right? You can just show the correct sprite. But 3D animation is very, very different, right? We're actually calculating in a hierarchy, a tree from a root node, and basically applying matrix transformations down that tree over time. Okay. And if you have to like redo that over again by rolling back, it's of course going to be more expensive.
Okay.
Right. And 3D games do have I'm not just talking about fighting games and all modern games, they employ all kinds of different strategies to make that optimal. There's a lot of
Okay.
caches in various places, so you just have to be very careful about how you handle those corrections. But again, other types of games have this, right? Even server-based games have these corrections.
Okay.
So these engines do handle that kind of stuff. You just have to be careful about it.
Right. Because I mean, again, I'm not too well versed in modeling and exactly how 3D graphics and that kind of stuff works, but basically, I mean, we've all seen when a character gets T-posed, right? Because that's
Yep.
the default state, right, of the
Mhm.
character. So basically, a model is just a bunch of mathematical calculations of angles and physics based off of the default pose, right?
Yep, you're just calculating down the tree like you have an shoulder node, and you go down to the elbow, down to the wrist. You're just okay, rotate it this way, move it this way. You take that transform and you apply it to the next node, and you take its transform and apply it to the next node, and then you got to like merge all those values if you have two animations that are blending, right? So it is expensive.
Right. Okay.
That's the main thing you have to take into
And
account. And of course, yep, go ahead.
oh no, I was about to say, and that's essentially how things like Tekken slow mo and everything like that work, right? Because obviously, normally the moves play out animation the same way, but when you
Right.
slow down the game, because it's just about your mathematical calculations, now you can calculate all the in betweens and display the in betweens properly on slowdown, right?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that's just entirely a visual effect that has no implication on the gameplay itself. I think they probably still tick at the same amount of ticks happen in the same time effectively, right? Even though visually it's slowed down. So,
Yeah, I know that there's one example that I think they did mess that up on, which
oh
is a
really?
UMVC3 for Strider. His
Mm.
crouching heavy punch in X Factor, like it moves faster, and I think they just messed it up because the farthest point at which it can hit, that point accidentally gets skipped in the speed up, so he loses
So
range.
it's interesting. I don't know if you know much about TJ Combo and Killer Instinct, but he has had the speed up mode, right? Like,
Oh, right.
um, did that make it in the final game? Yeah, I think it did. It's been a while, but yeah, we had similar issues where you didn't want to skip over collision frames, right? But we had good programming teams, so they took care of that pretty well.
Dang, and even
No.
someone in the chat, Shay in the chat, is saying that there are some interactions in Tekken slow mos that have different outcomes versus normal gameplay. So interesting,
Hmm.
interesting. But so I know everybody wants me to ask this. I want to ask it too. So speaking of Tekken 7, there's obviously this meme and everyone talking about the 3 frames of rollback,
Right.
happening in
Yeah.
Tekken. From your point of view, obviously you don't know what's actually going on in the engine, and again,
Mhm.
3 frames is such a short amount of time. But
Right.
from what you can tell, is there actually any rollback in Tekken 7 at all, or is it still mostly just a delayed based netcode game?
Well, as far as I can tell, there's some amount of it. How much they apply, I'm not sure of. And I think Tekken works in a very similar way to every other fighting game. It sends inputs to both players. Well, you have one player send their inputs to the other, and then you can finally update your game when you get that input. Whether or not they do a correction, I'm not sure of. And you can speculate on like other strategies they would be using for rollbacks, not necessarily resimulation, which is rerunning the game for those frames. Yeah, I mean, I could see reasons why they didn't potentially implement a large number of rollbacks. One could be performance, right? Maybe their game is not optimized enough to actually perform more simulations per frame, right? That's a realistic possibility, especially if they didn't have the time to get that out and stuff like that. So, because optimizing modern games isn't easy. It is an easy thing, right? Especially when you have things like gameplay code that is what we call CPU bound, which basically means unless you change the gameplay code itself, you're not going to make it any faster because gameplay code runs on the CPU. As opposed to GPU bound, where the graphics are really what's holding you back. Oh. So I
So
mean that's a speculation on my part. I don't know of any details there. So yeah.
okay, so when you say like CPU bound and GPU bound, does you mean like that would affect when you roll back to a save state and have to recalculate everything? It couldn't basically play it faster, or
Yeah. So assuming you have like 5 frames of network latency. Well, it takes
Mhm.
5 frames of game time to get the input from the other player. That means you're going to need to rerun 5 frames of the game simulation,
Right.
right? You restore 5 frames ago, rerun those inputs, but you need to do that within the current actual 1 frame game time. Otherwise, your game itself is going to slow down. So that's one possibility. Every game has a limit on how many frames it can actually resimulate. You can't resimulate forever. You're
Right, of
never going to
course,
see
of
a game
course.
that does 100 frames of resimulation. I don't know if you're going to even want 100 frames
Right,
of
I know.
rollback, but
It's gonna be kind of gross anyway.
yeah.
And
But
so,
I think luckily, yeah.
does that have to do with the setting in a lot of the rollback games where you can set the frame count, or like the latency, or that's always been one area that, like, that's kind of confused me. So for like a lot of those games, there's that setting that you can change of how many, what is it, maximum frames that you can roll back for.
Right.
What
So
exactly is
yeah.
that doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I always talk a little bit about the nature of network latency in the first place, or lag. You can't eliminate latency. It's going to be there.
Yeah.
Whatever time it's going to take for your inputs to get to the other player, you're going to have to do something about it, right? Normally, until rollbacks were commonly implemented in these games, that's why you added input delay to your local game, right? Because you wanted to make sure that you're running both inputs on both games at the same time. Because what we're talking about here is you're giving the same commands to a program, in this from the same state of each time. Basically, the program has to be in the same state before you run those inputs to get the same results.
Right.
So the latency has to be compensated by something, right? Again, with rollbacks, we just kind of ignore it until we get the input and we just resimulate. That's how we compensate for that latency. But you can reduce your rollbacks, right? If you compensate it somewhere else by adding, maybe you don't want to have 0 frames of input delay because you want to see less rollbacks. Well, then you add a few additional frames of latency to your local input, right? This guarantees that the other player will get the input on the frame with less desynchronization, because effectively you'll be running this. Say, for a concrete example, if I'm sending it to you, my input for frame 5, if it gets to your computer at frame 7 as opposed to frame 10,
Right.
because I'm saying this input is not for frame 5, it's for frame 7 or whatever, then we both run it at frame 7. Then you have less correction to do, because
Right.
the time between you're actually needing this input and when you do the correction is smaller, because you added that additional time by increasing your input delay on your side.
Okay. Okay.
Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, again, if anybody in the chat wants any sort of like kind of clarification, just let me know in the chat as well. But I mean, one of the things that I thought of, I still remember, I think it was in HDR. Like, one of the very first things that happened in HDR was that Vega's Claw caused a lot of desyncs, because it was random on when it popped off, and I think they just didn't account for that. And so on some screens, on some games, it would pop off, and other games, on the other side, it would stay on and such. And for characters like Faust and stuff, where they actually throw random items, how does that work? Like, how does rollback account for that kind of situation?
Well, first let me say that computers, I think I mentioned this before, they never do anything that's random.
Right.
What we see as random is called pseudo random number generators. Effectively, they look random because the number you get is kind of like wildly different than the previous number. So for humans, you can't really understand the algorithm that they're actually generating these numbers, or you just can't do it on the fly, right? So these are just algorithms that are completely deterministic, right? If you start from the same initial conditions, you're always going to get the same result afterwards. Right. So if you basically start both random number generators in the same state on both computers, you're always going to get the same random number come out of it, right? So often what would happen is maybe something is either calling that random number generator externally from the gameplay that's not dealt with the rollbacks, that's affecting that random number generator, because
Right.
most algorithms, the way they work is when you call the random number generator function, it changes its internal state, right? So if anything external, say like a VFX or something, is calling that same function, and the VFX is not tied to the game simulation, then you're going to get a desync. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
and I've
How
seen that happen. So.
like how hard is it to prevent these kind of desyncs? I mean, either do these things just like happen all the time from just completely random things that you didn't think of?
It definitely could happen, especially if you have shared functionality between your game code and your presentation code, like your rendering stuff and your particle effects. If you keep that stuff separate, if you don't make it possible for, say, particle effect to call gameplay code, then you should be okay,
Okay.
right? You need to completely isolate the gameplay side of the game versus the engine and everything else. So.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even like for example, two people playing on the same match can have different backgrounds and stuff, and so even if
Right.
particles are random which way they go, that shouldn't affect if they both have it slightly different, as long as it has nothing to do with the gameplay, right?
Yep, if they're calling external functionality, it should be completely fine.
Okay. Uh, I want to repeat what someone said in the chat here. So Shay says, to sum up, Zinac said there is rollback in Tekken 7. So I mean, is that something that you would be on record for saying, or?
I'll just say I've seen evidence of the game correcting itself, so
Okay.
that's all I'm gonna say.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm not trying to put you on the on the hook for that. So, but okay. Okay. So, I mean, just in terms of you working on, rollback throughout your, your time, you've mentioned Killer Instinct, you've mentioned a little bit of Skullgirls, your own games with, Guilty Gear Strive and stuff. Like, I'm just curious, do you have any like anecdotes or just like completely weird things that like stick out to you in particular? Like, God, I never would have thought that this would cause any problems with rollback netcode or anything like that. Just to kind of illustrate to people the funkiness that rollback netcode can cause.
Hmm. It's hard to say because there honestly is a lot of problems. You just have to like knock each of those problems out one by one, right? Like so many things presented themselves. So, like the before mentioned, pseudo random number stuff, right? You wouldn't imagine, oh, there's something calling this gameplay random number generator outside that's causing the desync, right? You wouldn't have imagined that initially, but once you see it happen, then you know. Yeah. Other things are just like making particle effects and other kind of visual effects look good under rollbacks. That's just a very difficult thing to do some of the time, depending on how that effect has been implemented. Because, games, a lot of fighting games use like pretty elaborate effects, not just as flashy stuff on the screen, but as part of your visual understanding of how a move hits, right? You think of characters like Zato, right? Zato has his Eddie, and Eddie attacks with all these different kind of like slashes and shadow things. All that stuff you have to be careful about because engines like Unreal, they're not really designed to perfectly replicate a particle effect the same way
Right,
second time,
right.
right? So even if it doesn't affect gameplay, visually, if it's different or too different, the player's gonna go, "Huh, that's weird." Like why isn't it touching the other? You've seen these memes on Twitter, right? Why isn't this move's not even touching them?
Right,
you
yeah.
know? Yeah. So that kind of stuff is what really ends up being difficult, and you end up spending a lot of your time on that.
Okay. I mean, Suna in the chat mentions, Exerd when they in the beta that Chip's leaf grab was causing a lot of issues before as well. Any insight? Would you happen to have any insight onto what was causing that?
Leaf grab. I didn't actually see that bug.
Okay.
I only got to play a few matches with Exert rollbacks. It seemed pretty good to me, but I did not play against a chip. So, I mean, what was the bug? Was it a desynchronization or was it just a visual glitch?
I heard that some people said it was like it kind of messed up his animation or something like that. Like he would get stuck in one pose or something while he was jumping. I can't remember. Someone in the he didn't disappear when leaf grab started. Interesting.
Okay, yeah. So, not only do you need to like roll back gameplay stuff, the most important thing, of course, is synchronizing the gameplay. If you don't do that, you won't even have a match. It will just character will end up on this side of the screen, running into the corner, attacking the wall, right?
Right. Yeah.
But you do need to be very careful about visual effects, like I mentioned before, because if you don't properly restore those as well, yeah, the character is supposed to be invisible, suddenly not invisible anymore, and vice versa, right? You don't want your character to be invisible for us to match, like, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that can easily happen if you're not careful. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, Caramel Jenkins mentions too, like a crazy projectile character like Arakune and Blaze Blue. It's kind of the same question that I mentioned with Mana, but in the end, it just because they're throwing a bunch of projectiles all over the screen. Like if it was Marvel 3 and Doom is just shooting lasers everywhere, it necessarily wouldn't. Like the more projectiles actually wouldn't make things particularly more difficult, right?
yeah, I mean, as far as visual goes, it's like kind of two things you can do. You can make your visual effects entirely stateless, which is basically if you feed them in all the parameters of the current game state, it will just render it correctly. The other thing you can do is if you do have state for your particle effects, often they do, then you have to store that state as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Otherwise,
Okay.
you have to re-simulate the whole particle effect over time,
Right.
and that can get expensive.
And even things like in
yeah.
UMVC3, because every projectile had their own durability stat and everything like that, right? So everything that's on the screen has to be kind of stored in that memory as well, right?
But I think that part would be the gameplay state, so it shouldn't. It wouldn't have been a big issue, I
Okay.
imagine. Yeah, I think. Well, I think last season of Killer Instinct, we had characters with tons of projectiles, right? And we somehow made it work. So yeah,
Okay.
think of Arya and stuff like that, right? Tons of
Right,
particle
yeah.
effects. Effectively Marvel style assists. Yeah.
Nice. Now, early on when people were developing rollback netcode and everything, there was always this kind of, argument that yes, obviously rollback makes your game more playable online and everything like that. But man, you have to put in that much more work to implement rollback. You have like it scales up the project. If you're designing the game from scratch with rollback, do you feel like that it really does kind of increase the scope of the game, or do you feel like that part's been kind of exaggerated by people?
Once you start, if you're making a game from scratch, it's so much easier to implement rollbacks. As long as you set up your framework just right, and everybody on your team is knowledgeable of what you need to do to handle rollbacks, then you're fine. It's just when you're retrofitting is when it becomes becomes more expensive. Yeah, but once you've done the retrofitting, then it's like for every title afterwards, if you keep the same code base and you keep the same principles, you'll be fine.
Right. Now, obviously, this is something that I think, again, used to be a misunderstanding, but I think people understand it right now a lot better. But, most people know that netcode is not just like this nebulous layer that you can just unscrew off of one and then screw on the other, that there's a lot more to it than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just fighting games. If you ever pay attention to any of these like GDC talks about, server-based games, they have all these things you have to do with gameplay, visual presentation to deal with network synchronization.
Okay.
Right? And there's no plug and play. Like that isn't a reality on anything. Any kind of game.
I've been forgetting to change my my topics over here. But that's fine. That was all just like the interview section here. So I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I kind of asked you this beforehand coming on the show, because obviously I have the questions that I want to ask and everything like that. But you're probably sitting here every time rollback comes up, you're reading Twitter, and there's just people spouting about everything in fighting games, like they know everything about rollback, and you're probably seeing misinformation left and right. Is there anything in particular that you see often that you just want to like put the kibosh on right now and be like, look, this is how it works, okay?
Yeah, one thing I see a lot is people assuming that when we say rollbacks, we're talking about the game actually reverting to a previous state. The player never sees that. That is done internally by the game engine. What you're seeing is just a correction to what the current state should be. You're, the problem is the word rollbacks kind of implies the game's actually rolling back, but honestly, you don't even need to technically do the whole rollback part of it. You can there's a conceivable way you can implement the game where you don't actually do rollbacks like that. But because of the naming, a lot of people just assume that, oh, undoing what I did. That's the big thing. People think the thing they did was undone. No, that's not the case. If you're playing with delay-based netcode, you would have seen the exact same results. These games are entirely deterministic. Whether or not you use delay-based netcode or you use rollback netcode, same results are going to happen.
Right. Yeah. And that just made me think of something else too. Sorry to kind of derail this a little bit, but obviously, as you mentioned earlier, no netcode is going to make it so that things work better. Gonna make you play perfect if you're playing like from California to France, right? Like there's no way to really solve that distance problem. But I remember before Mike Z was taken off the project, he had mentioned that there was like some improvement he made to the Skullgirls netcode. Is that something that you're familiar with, that he said would make it feel even better for that kind of distance?
I don't know exactly what he was talking about, to be honest, but there are things you can do, right? You can make trade-offs between the two players. You can say, okay, I'm going to take on more rollbacks, but to make your experience better. If you're just being friendly to them, you're like, yeah, I'll let you have less rollbacks, and I can deal with playing with that. That's kind of thing you could do. If you add those options to games, I think it gets a little more confusing for players that don't really understand what the trade-offs are, right? So that's kind of tricky for developers to decide whether or not they support that kind of thing. And there's other ways you could conceivably reduce the number of rollbacks you get. If you can guarantee the game won't change after a correction, then you could just not do the rollback. Right. And depending on the game, yeah, it would be different. So
and again, rollback, that's one of the things that's also said too, right? You kind of touched on that too, that rollback is essentially delay-based netcode. If you switch it to, what was it, like 0 max rollback frames, right? Then it's basically the exact same thing, right?
It is.
Okay. But sorry to derail you. Anything else that sticks out to you from what people have said, talking about rollback?
Yeah, there's a point about rollbacks, or just like netcode in general, that I'm a big stickler for. When you have delay-based netcode, not only is it delay-based, but it's also a variable delay. So in order to, the internet changes conditions all the time. You might have more latency this frame or this time versus that time. So unless you have your input delay constantly changing in delay-based netcode, you may not get input in time on your client, and your game's just going to stop. And you've all seen this, where the game like stutters, it stops, and then it continues running normally, right? And then you drop your combo, your input got consumed. That's awful. The nice thing about rollbacks is you can have a trade-off. You can have fixed input delay, but the rollbacks compensate for that up and down latency behavior of the internet. So it hides that variability behind rollbacks, and it doesn't affect your input. Your inputs won't get dropped, which is great because you can learn your combos with a specific timing, and you can always do it the same way. If you have variable input delay, you can't do that because you always get this feeling of like, did my input get eaten? Was it me or was it the game? Like, and you could always blame it on the game at that point. But once you add rollbacks, you can't blame the game anymore. It's all you. So
but even for games with rollback, like Strive, we still see like the delay frame counter on the top of the screen. So like what is that indicating? It shouldn't change how the game feels. It's just the potential of the length of rollback that you might see, right?
Yeah, it's just to indicate the variability of the current network that you're on, right? If there's more network latency over one period of time versus the next period of time, of course you're going to have more rollbacks. That lets you see that, but the input delay won't change.
Right. Okay. Any other things that you want to address before I open it up to the viewers to see if they have any questions here?
Well, just from a few years ago, we're now going into a new world where all these games have rollback netcode, right? We went from a situation where most people couldn't play each other to a situation where everybody could play each other essentially, right?
Yeah.
Now it's not a worldwide, but definitely it's continental wide. You can play pretty much everybody as if almost like playing them locally,
Yeah.
right? So that means so many more players can get better at these games, right? And the competition is just going to get much, much stronger. I want people to think about, especially people who are becoming game developers in this industry, like where do we go from here, right? What improvements can we make past rollbacks? Because the rollbacks were such a white well for so long, right? We need,
Mhm.
honestly, Street Fighter 4 should have had rollbacks. We had GPO at the time.
It was there
AC
for so
Remix
long.
had it.
Right.
Yeah, it's like we're 10 years, almost 15 years behind on this technology. So we're finally here. So where do you go? What does it mean? I want people to really think about that, especially if you want to get into developing these games. I've been doing it long now. I'm kind of taking a break at the moment. Hopefully, I'll get back into making fighting games in a few years. But I want to see new people come around and come up with new ideas.
Mhm.
I don't think rollbacks are the end of it as far as improving fighting games. So I really want to see what people can come up with.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, just to kind of expand on what you mentioned about how rollback has really improved the quality of play. I mean, I think I just don't look any further than Strive, right? I mean, directly right now, Strive has always been such a Japan dominated game. But now what we're seeing here is when you have all these players playing Strive and they can practice with each other all the time. You see the Razos and Jonathan Tenes and Umi shows, playing at just these extremely high levels. I mean, I still love what one of my viewers actually said one time. We were talking about ways to help beginners get into fighting games and stuff, and he was like, honestly, the best way to get beginners into fighting games is just have good rollback net code.
If you get more quality matches with people at your level, it's going to make the experience so much better for you as a new fighting game player. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
All right. Well, I guess at this point in time, I will open this up to people in the chat here if they have any questions that they want to ask. Just make sure you type like an J Chenzor in the chat so I know that I can, spot these things in particular. But Shay asks, I'll just go with the first one right here with Shay that I see is Shay is asking is what are the next areas that netcode can or should improve on in this new generation? Do you have any ideas, or is this just one of those things that like whoever can figure it out, go for it?
Right. I think beyond the actual synchronization between games, right? Things like matchmaking, ranked matches.
Yeah.
We really need to facilitate getting players of similar skill level together. I think that's just something we haven't done very well in fighting games. And probably it's a hard problem because one versus one it's much harder to measure people's skill
Yeah.
on that versus team, where you can kind of like mix different skill levels together, and kind of get an average result. So yeah, I think that's a thing we can really improve on.
And I think that's also really important to discern as well, because I know a lot of people get this confused. So we really need to make sure people understand that there's a huge separation difference between the server matchmaking code as well as the net code, right? So like, for example, the problems that are plaguing KOF 15 right now, the matchmaking and stuff, that has nothing to do with net code and rollback, and for like Street Fighter 6, the beta, by limiting it to the number of people, they're more testing the net code than actually the server matchmaking stuff, right? So
Okay. Hmm.
okay.
I wasn't aware of those problems. Yeah.
So let's see. Well, Fanta asks, do you consider yourself part of the FGC? I'll let you answer that part first. So, do you play a lot of fighting games? Do you play a lot of fighting
Oh,
games?
I wonder. Up until recently, I was playing Xrd competitively in the tournament scene. I might have placed top 8 in a few tournaments, but no, I've been playing fighting games as a little kid. Before I even was aware of the FGC, like everybody in the early '90s, I was obsessed with games like Mortal Kombat, Killer
Hmm.
Instinct, Street Fighter, and eventually the Virtual Fighters and Tekkens when they came out. In high school, the big thing that was happening at the time was we got the Versus series, right? So
Hmm.
I just remember when my friend got a Japanese copy for the Dreamcast of Capcom versus SNK 2. And I was like, whoa, this thing is crazy. And he had like the mass fight stick. And I'm like, what is this about? Oh, fighting games. I didn't know all this stuff existed. You know, eventually found SRK and got completely obsessed with the freaking certain threads on the SRK and found my local scene. I was like, wow, this whole freaking world exists. It's so different now because, you have Twitch, you have Twitter. It's kind of hard not to be aware of the scene, I guess, now. Back then, there's only a few. Yeah.
How cool is it that you're working on games like Strive now? I mean, is that just like if you told yourself 10 years ago that this was a thing, you'd just be like, no way.
No, I didn't think it was gonna happen. Honestly, I was like, they're not gonna hire me. Like, who am I? So they did. So okay.
And just to follow
really
up
cool.
on Fanta's question here, sorry to interrupt you here before it scrolls off the screen here. Fanta also asked, do you feel like having that previous understanding of fighting games makes your job easier, and does it feel like that it makes it better to hire from the community, or is that something that has pros and cons?
I think it's mostly positive. If you looked at the Killer Instinct team, tons of people there were from the community. Obviously, Keats, right? But we also had Mighty Mar on the team there. Delrat, a bunch of guys. Even the programmers love fighting games, right? So because you're aware how these games are supposed to work. When problems present themselves that are obvious to fighting game players, you can just go ahead and fix it. You don't have to wait for the game to be released, right? You don't have to put it in front of a bunch of fighting game players. Right. So I think that's a great point. There's a small downside, I think, to the creative aspect of these games. When you become so familiar with these games, you assume they need to work in a certain way, right? So you don't necessarily see any potential new way of doing stuff in fighting games. So I think it's partially why you've seen fighting games kind of be very samey for the last 20 years. So hopefully we can break away from that at some point and see some new stuff. But we'll see. We'll see what Project L brings.
Dang, yeah. Well, that could be a whole. I mean, maybe we'll save that a little bit more for the end. But Mike Lee Story asks, "What is run ahead, and when should and shouldn't people use it?"
The only time I've ever heard run ahead is when you go ahead and simulate future game frames, and then you check to see if that matches what it should be. Technically, if you have enough processing power, it might be worth doing. I'm not aware of any fighting games that necessarily implement run ahead. It's something I'll have to put more thought into.
Because I know when people say, like part of it is, rollback is predicting what the opponent is going to do. It's most just repeating the last input that was there, right? So
another reason why fighting games are so good for rollbacks is even if you repeat the same input, it's very similar to what a player is going to do, right? Because you can't, most of the time, you're not hitting a button and releasing it in one frame. You're pressing it and holding it for a few frames and releasing. So it's most likely going to match what the inputs were going to be.
Right.
Anyway, so
he says that something about Fightcade using it and might be just them, basically giving a name to that idea that you just you have to play ahead a few frames if you do have that disconnect, right?
Yeah, I think it's just a way to again, I'm not exactly sure about the implementation, so I really don't want to talk about it. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
Now, Naleb asks, does voice chat can affect netcode performance? And I'm assuming again that that's just because it has nothing to do with the gameplay. Those two things won't interrupt each other at all, right?
I'm just not aware of any case where that's happened. Conceivably, anything that feeds into the same computer could affect performance, right? So I can imagine a scenario that happens, but I don't know of any particular game where that's been a problem.
Now that just reminds me, because in Street Fighter V, it has been proven that if you smash on the controller as fast as you can mess up rollback even more. Is that something that you can prevent from happening?
Right. So I think what's going on there is there's some performance penalty when it's checking to do rollbacks, and the way we handle. So something I did not talk about is, how do we even determine that we need to roll back in the first place, right? You could look at the game state and see if things desynchronize at some kind of variable that are shared between both both clients, like maybe the position of both players. You go, oh, okay, they're different, so let's roll back. That's not how we really do things. What we do is we look at the inputs and say, was the inputs we expected to use different than what I got from the other player? If they're different, then roll back and resimulate. That's the easiest way to do it.
Okay.
Now, if you're not constantly testing your game to make sure it can be performant at the max rollback count, like I think NetherRealm, they made sure their game could run 8 whole simulations every time they roll back. Then yeah, you could have that problem if you kind of like don't check that, if you're not careful. So if your rollbacks are just not performant, yeah, of course, if you mash on the buttons, it's going to cause more performance problems. I don't know if that's what's going on with Street Fighter V, but it's definitely something I could see happening.
Right, because it doesn't happen with most of the other games, right? Like in KI and Strive, like that doesn't happen if you're just like spinning the controller and stuff.
Yeah, KI and Strive we tested with simulator rollbacks going on, like max simulator rollbacks going on all the time. So we knew when we saw performance problems and fixed them.
Okay.
So yeah.
Oni Ramen asks, is it even technically viable to suggest having something like a local mode for a game with no baked-in delay versus online modes having baked-in delay to accommodate fewer rollbacks? I'm not exactly sure what that means. Do you understand that a little bit?
Yeah, I know he's talking about. So like I've mentioned before, you have to compensate for lag somewhere, right? Now, I think the idea is if you bake in input delay offline, when you go online, you're not going to feel any additional delay.
Oh, that, right. Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Because it's going to be compensated for, right? It's going to be compensating for that network delay once you go online. It's just going to give it time for your input to travel across the network. That's a very controversial topic, because if you say, I'm adding lag to your input offline, competitive players don't take that very well, right? You're making our games feel worse. My reaction times are going to be so many frames worse now. But of course, you can design the game around that. But I haven't seen anybody actively trying to do that yet. So
okay. So let's see. Vithigar asks, sometimes when a game doesn't have rollback, people just say, just use GGPO like it's a drop-in solution, right? We talked a little bit about that, and you touched on some of this already, but can you speak a little to how much of a lift adding GGPO is? So like how much GGPO actually does itself already, clock sync, state tracking, how much still has to be handled by the game developers? So actually, that's a beautiful question right there. So if you take, obviously, GGPO, which is free out there for anyone to use, does that save you a lot of time?
at the very beginning, it can, if you want to quickly get up and running. But I think ultimately you'll want to have a solution that's more adapted for your game. Because there are places you can make optimizations, you can make assumptions that GDPO can't, because it's a general solution instead of a specific one. And there are a few issues if you implement GDPO incorrectly that could cause things like the drifting problem I mentioned before, if you don't understand what's going on there. Mm-hmm. And again, it's one of those problems where it's like a chicken and egg problem, where like if you understand all the problems, of course, you can probably implement the netcode yourself. But if you don't understand the problems and you use GPO incorrectly, then you're not going to know what to look for to fix. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I think for clever engineers, it's a quick solution to get going, but probably you'll want to replace it eventually.
Okay. Because I mean, even like Strive and Killer Instinct is more the in-house version, netcode, right? It wasn't really like built off of GGPO, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say is both games had an existing network layer that was used. So
okay. Just a very general question here from Backdrift. What is your favorite fighting game? And in your opinion, which fighting game is designed best, like system-wise?
So, I mean, my number one fighting game for sure is Vampire Savior. I've been playing that game. I've been playing your background.
Yeah.
I've been Lele player since I was in high school. The game just has that speed and the quick decision making that very few fighting games now have. Yeah. You have so much time in modern games where you can just kind of think strategically, which I think people really love that. But Vampire Savior is like all instinct. Like you don't have time. It's like Marvel, right? You don't have time to really think. Right, you have to like feel. Right. And of course you can come up with game plans ahead of time, but when you're playing, man, it's just like it's all adrenaline.
Yeah.
And I think all the Marvel players understand it as well. So
That's everyone's saying, "Oh, so that's why I brought you on." Oh
yeah.
man. Let's see here. What does so Ace Bunyan ask, what does Zinac make of Project L's implementation of rollback with implementing servers? Yeah, and he even says that he's not sure exactly what they're doing differently. We saw them mention something about that. Do you have any idea what that is, or can you speak to that idea at all?
Well, I think what he's talking about is effectively a custom packet routing solution they have. They already use
Mm,
for League, which is basically they have servers set up in specific locations, and I think they have like deals with ISPs as well, where they can send it, they can route their packets very specifically. Uh, um,
mm,
so that shouldn't affect the actual gameplay synchronization, other than maybe reducing latency. Um, I can't speak any more
right.
past that. Yeah,
But
I don't really
basically,
know.
the main thing is that because fighting games, again, matchmaking, two people talk to a server, the server says, hey, you two play each other, and then those two connect to each other directly. That connection between the two players can change all the time, right? Depending
Yeah.
on which way the data packets are being routed. So what you're saying is that because it's kind of server based, they will have a fixed path almost, and deals with the ISPs
Yeah.
potentially, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I
Okay.
could see where that would have benefits. Most companies wouldn't be able to do that because they're not Riot. So yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. I mean,
Helps to have a lot of helps to have that League of Legends Riot money.
existing relationships with ISPs and
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Oh man. So Akuma Thurman asks, can you ask if you could add rollback to one fighting games these days? What would it be? So if you could retrofit rollback into one fighting game, what would it be?
That's a tough question. For a while, it's like Exert. It's like obvious to me. It was like the game you need to do it for, right? To me, it's like what game is gonna like reach the most people who would love to have it, right? Man, it's I don't know. I really don't know. Because again, this it's been happening so much lately. I don't know. Maybe a CVS2. Get it? That would be really cool.
I see a lot of
Um, yeah.
UMVC3 in the chat here, and that's
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. It's a good one actually. Huh. I forgot that.
UMVC3. Yeah, I think would be a,
Yeah.
a, a big one right there. Man, let me see what other
Oh, King of Fighters
questions.
13 would be great. King of
What's
Fighters 13.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I'd love to still roll back that code. So,
Okay, okay. Let's see. What other questions do we have here? Tiny Tech says that the SF6 beta had variable delay. It would change based on ping. Is there a way to implement that without the user feeling its effects, or is it objectively a suboptimal solution that would ideally be changed before launch?
if it is the case that the input delay is changing based on ping, then the player is going to feel it, right? If suddenly my input comes out a few frames later, my move comes out a few frames later than it did the moment before, you're going to notice that, right? And it's not going to
Right.
feel great. I don't know why they're doing variable. Again, I don't know if that's the case, but if they
Right.
are, I don't understand why they would decide to do that. I know there's of course, developers can't help it. They're looking online and you see complaints about one thing or the other, and maybe they're just thinking, "Oh, I don't want to see people complaining about the rollbacks," and maybe this is a way to
Right.
compensate for it. But it's just like, man, we already know this is such a good solution for
Yeah.
every fighting game, and why are you doing things differently?
Right. I mean, did you get into the Street Fighter 6 beta by any chance?
I didn't, but I did go to TGS. I was able to play for a
Oh,
while in
sick. Okay,
person.
okay.
So yeah,
I'm
I
just
was like,
wondering if you had a chance to play the online, and if there was anything, like it felt
oh.
pretty standard straightforward quality rollback to you.
No, I wasn't unable to get in, but
Okay.
I have a lot of hope for Capcom now. It seems like they are putting the right resources into that game. I'm very excited for it. It's been a long time since it seemed like Capcom really cared about their fighting games. So
Yeah.
this is an exciting time for sure.
Yeah, and that's
I think
another
they'll do
question
right.
too. So Cross Tekken had
Mm.
rollback, right? And
Yep.
I'm sorry, MVCI had rollback, right? So
Mm.
is is that confirmed that both of them ran on rollback?
They both have rollbacks. I can't speak to the quality of it, right? I heard MVCI. has good rollback netcode.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely better than Street Fighter V, but I didn't play much of that online, to be honest. Yeah, and I think that those games were made at a time that Capcom when a lot of fighting game players did have influence over those titles, right? I think Seth Kelly in particular had a lot of influence over
Yeah.
Street Fighter Cross Tekken, so I can see why those games got it. And
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Let's see here. I don't see any other questions here. So, got absorbing the net code. Oh my gosh,
right,
someone
word
typed that
based
in
netcode.
from the Sega situation. Ugh, man. But yeah, let me know if anybody else in the chat has any questions here. But do you feel like Project L could potentially like change the game a lot, or do you feel like it's you know do you feel like that they have the ability to, because you talked about how we need to do better, the rollback is not the end of it, like do you feel like even from just a net code side of things, do you think Project L has room for some clever advancements in net code?
Right, the Kennons were the guys that came up with the GTPO in the first place, right? And I'm sure they've been thinking
Right.
this for a very, very, very long time.
Hmm.
So I'm sure they have some tricks up their sleeves they're implementing to make it a better experience for players. And Riot having their whole infrastructure for League of Legends, they're very experienced with matchmaking. I'm sure they're gonna do it well. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. It's taking a little longer than I thought it was going to take for that game to come out, but hopefully they're putting the right resources in the right places on that game. So
I
we'll
mean,
see what
I
they do.
remember when they first developed it, it was on Final Burn as well. I think the emulator, and I remember
Oh,
playing
right, yeah.
Alpha. Was it Alpha 2 or Alpha 3?
Alpha
Like
Two is the
really
first
early
game.
on.
Yep,
Yeah, I
yep.
remember playing it and trying out the net code, and I was like, "This feels great! Wow, this will be cool." That was like 20 some years ago.
Yeah, it was like 2006, 2007, 2006-ish, right? And I got the beta code because I think we are all on like the SRK IRC channel and
Yeah.
Capcom, and we all got beta access. And I'm like,
Hmm.
this changes everything. Like every fighting game's gonna have this now. Big surprise, when I learned that Street Fighter 4 didn't have it or Blaze Blue didn't have it, and
Oh man.
yeah, here
Yeah.
we are, nearly 15 years later.
God.
Yeah.
Well, Mike Lee asks, as a programmer, how do you feel about glitches and bugs that affect gameplay, like roll canceling or Zabble's unblockable and such?
It's a case by case basis. I played Faust, and of course he had the FD canceling on his dive kick, allowed him to float a little bit, and I thought it was a fun mechanic. And obviously Arc Sys did as well because they left it in for many games.
Yeah.
So sometimes those bugs do lead to creative gameplay, and I think it's awesome when they leave it in and kind of integrate it as the core strategy for characters. Of course, there's some bugs like option selects. I'm not a big fan of having too many option selects in your game because it makes the game so much about option selects,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Street
Hmm.
Fighter 4
Hmm.
had this problem. I was like, I don't want to learn all these option selects and play that game. No, I want to position my character in the right place and trick you into putting your character in the wrong place and not
Hmm.
all this kind of
Hmm.
input trickery. So yeah.
I mean, how hard, like, obviously for stuff like, this is a question from me now, for stuff like, Accent Core, one of the coolest things that, the rollback in that was literally a fan project. And then Arxis just kind of basically was like, well, hey, we'll fund you guys, to make it official kind of thing. And, as we've mentioned, it gets harder and harder for modern games. But, especially because you just don't have the code base, right? I mean, a lot of this work is just kind of like, I don't even know how it works, to be honest. I don't know how people are doing that, but how hard would it be for for fans to retrofit rollback into like UMVC 3 or even like a PC version of Soul Calibur 6? I only ask selfishly for that game.
Well, you need to talk to the guy who did what was it called? The melee rollback
Oh,
implementation.
Slippy.
I'm,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I was really impressed by that, how they're able to handle that on like a game with 3D rendering and stuff like that, through an emulator, no less, right? Or is it emulator, or is it actually running on console? I forget about the
I think
details of
that
that.
one's actually an emulator. I'm pretty sure that
Okay,
one's. Oh, Fizzy. Yeah, Slippy is the guy
busy.
who. Fizzy wrote it for Slippy, or is it Slippy wrote it for Fizzy? No, Fizzy wrote it for Slippy, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, Dolphin. Yeah, that's right. It's on the Dolphin emulator. That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I think once you get to more modern games, it gets difficult because most games are written to they use the maximum amount of time they can on the CPU. And in order to be able to roll back multiple frames, you need to have more time. And unless you can optimize the game along with, actually enabling rollbacks, then you're going to get nowhere because you're going to just have the game stuttering all the time, right? And
Right.
I think that's the biggest challenge of modern games. Now, that was an older game running on an emulator, so it was definitely possible for them to rerun the game multiple times per frame on modern PCs. But if you're looking at
Yeah.
something that got released for like a PS4, it might be a little difficult. Yeah.
Right. So in other words, a game like UMVC 3, which came out during the PS3, Xbox 360 era, is definitely something that they can do better with because the processing power of PCs has just gotten stronger, right? Whereas something like Soul Calibur 6, we might have to wait a few years before someone could retrofit rollback into something like that, right?
That's right. I think only recently we're seeing rollbacks for things like the Dreamcast and Naomi, right? And have they got any PS? I know there's some work for getting PS2 games to support rollbacks, but I'm not super familiar with that. But yeah,
Okay.
PS3 is getting there, but it's still difficult even just to emulate a PS3 game because of that architecture is so different than a
Right.
normal CPU, right? So,
Yeah. That's what made the PS3 really hard to develop for, right? It was kind of
yep.
that's the console that is known for being hard to make games for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. 360 games are probably way more viable for implementing rollbacks, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. Because 360 is still just kind of like a glorified PC in a way, right?
I think it's power PC architecture.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Huh,
yeah.
interesting. So, people in the chat are saying that Melee has a lightning fast mode. It was the framework for getting it to work. Yeah, I mean, that's true because I remember in training mode, you could like ratchet the speed up of Melee to like times 10 or something kind of ridiculous
Okay.
like that. So,
Well, maybe that's one of the reasons they were able to do it. That's cool.
yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't see too many other questions here in the chat, and like I said, I don't want to take up too much of your time or anything like that. But is there anything else that you wanted to add about rollback netcode, or just even like maybe like a preview of what you're doing or anything currently, or is that all still NDA?
Yeah, I mean, mostly what I'm doing now is NDA'd. Its projects are just starting out in development, so it's nothing I'm gonna be able to talk about for a very long time. But
Okay.
hopefully, if and when these things I'm working on do come out, I hope people get a chance to play them. And definitely I'll share that when it does happen, or if it happens. Eventually, maybe I'll get back to making fighting games. I'm kind of in a break from fighting game development right now. It's been a good 10 plus years where I've continuously worked on fighting games, so I want to reset my thinking about what does it mean, where are fighting games going in the future?
Right.
Like that's things I'm constantly thinking about. It's like we got to the point where the technology is finally caught up to have a good experience for these players on, when they're playing online, they could play across the country, across the world. So where are we going from here? I'm putting some time into thinking about that. And if anybody has any ideas where they want to see fighting games go, I'd love to hear about it. So
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, Daigo famously said on stream recently that he does feel like that fighting games might even feel a little outdated these days. And, I tend to agree. I think, like you said, because we've done it for so long in a certain way, we're still always doing a lot of fighting games in similar ways. And it's definitely a lot of room for change and variation. And I'm excited for that. So.
yeah, I really want to see what these young creators are able to do that are not, they don't have that assumption about what fighting games are supposed to be from the 90s, right? I really want to see this, what the so-called Gen Z does. They're just now graduating, getting out of university, coming into the industry. I want to see what they can come up with. So I think it is an exciting time if we can get those young people into the right teams to make these games. So. Yeah.
And how long have you been in Japan now? And how much are you enjoying it out there?
Yeah, I've been here about 5 years, and of
Oh,
course, the
dang.
last few has
Okay.
been pretty much me stuck in my room, as everybody around the world has been. But yeah, it's been good. Good food, things are not too expensive here.
Yeah.
You can have pretty easy life out here if you make the best of it. So, and I get to play in the arcades all the time. Unfortunately, there's less of them now, but
Right. Are you in Tokyo area? Are you in kind of Tokyo
yeah, I'm
area?
very close to Tokyo.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. So in other words, my last question will just be: you going to Evo Japan? Can I buy you a
Of
drink there?
course. Yeah, of course, man. Like, I'd love to grab a drink to anybody who's coming. Say hi. Don't be a stranger. It's
Yeah,
been so long since we've had people come here, so I'm really excited to have the FTC come out.
I miss
So,
Japan
yeah.
so much right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, thank you so much. I know when I hit you up, you're like, okay, let's do this. And I was like, oh, so I'm very grateful. Like I said, I definitely owe you a drink, or, maybe if we both have enough free time, I'll treat you to like a bowl of Kikambo ramen or something like that,
Oh, that's good. They have a curry place now too. It's really good.
I saw Mark
Yeah.
Man post up a picture
Yeah.
of that, and I was like,
Really good.
what the heck? I'm kind of mad about that. So.
Yeah. We're right next door, so hopefully they'll still be around.
Nice. We'll just eat both of them, right? You could go to the ramen
Yeah.
and then just go to the curry, just one right after the other. So
I might have to take an early night after that. Yeah.
exactly, cool. Well,
Cool.
other than that, again, thank you very much for showing up on the show, and again, really glad that we could get a lot of questions answered here, and kind of dispel some of those myths. If you guys are watching this on YouTube and you do have any questions for Zinac, where plug yourself, social media, all this stuff. Where can people hit you up?
Well, if Twitter's still around by the time you see this video, yeah, my Twitter account is right there. You can just message me, just mention me, ask questions if you'd like. I don't know what the algorithm's going to do, but I also have a co-host. If you know that website, I think I just set it up. I'm going to be talking more about game development there, probably less about FTC stuff. But yeah, cohost.org/Zinac, not the CM Zinac, but just the Zinac part is where I'm at.
So yeah, so
Yeah,
for the
pretty much what you mean.
for the podcast listeners, your Twitter is at CM Zinac, right? And
Yes.
I see Mighty Sandwich posting your YouTube link as well, youtube.com/c/Zinac, and even
So
your
I do have
GitHub.
well. I have a bunch of videos on game development and rollbacks in particular. I have a whole series explaining rollbacks. I started a series on beginner fighting game development. That's on hold right now as I'm a little busy at work, but I'll hopefully get that going again sometime beginning next year.
You're gonna have to teach me, because I would love to one day like try to sit
Yeah.
down and make a fighting game. That's like one of the dreams, right? Obviously.
Yeah, we could speak for another 5 hours about like how these games were been put together, right?
Oh,
Not
yeah.
even just about the rollbacks, but like it's all the like specific knowledge you need to make a fighting game, because it's very difficult if you want to make a game that's comes from the heritage of Street Fighter, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah. I used to on the Classic Tuesday show. I used to ask this all the time. Where does Zinac come from anyway? Where does the name come from?
Uh, it's incredibly like programmer nerdy thing where I was trying to log into a Sun, I think it was a Sun Solaris OS shell account somewhere in the 90s, and it just randomly generated an account for me, and it was basically random letters and numbers, and I just turned it into a pronounceable name. So
Oh, dang.
it was like DN4K or something like that, and I was like, oh, it looks like Zinac, and I think once I kind of got into the FTC, it was like nobody's gonna know how to pronounce this, so I just wrote it out. So
Nice.
yeah.
I love it. I love how we all come up with our nicks in all these crazy different ways. So, but yeah,
It's funny now. I think Zinac's a drug now, so
Is
every time
it?
if you search for me, you're gonna see like a lot of results about a specific drug. Yeah.
Oh no. All right. No affiliation with the drug here.
Medication. It's not a legal substance, but
Okay. There was one more. Oh, that's right. You also do stream on Twitch every once in a while as well, right?
yeah, I was doing it regularly. Like I said, right now we're at busy time at work, so I will not be doing that for a little while. But hopefully, you can get back at doing it as soon as I can find some free time. So
Okay, and that one is just Zinac? Or is it CM Zinac?
honestly, like I'm so bad at remembering this stuff. Yeah, it is Zinac. It's just on Twitter that somebody got the handle before me somehow. even though I signed up like 11 years ago, someone already had Zinac. I don't.
Right. Just like, what the
So it
heck?
had to become CM Zinac. So
Okay, fair enough. All righty then. Again, thank you so much for stopping by, and thank you for answering these questions. And like I said, if you have any questions for him that you think of later on, or if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on Spotify, hit him up at CM Zinac on Twitter. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for tuning in for the show today. Hope that this has been educational, and hope I can do more interviews like this that shed light on a lot of facets of the of FGC. And if you have anybody else that you'd like me to bring on, let me know. And outside of that, thanks again, Zinac. And I know the day is starting for you, so have a good one, and we'll see you soon.
thank you, James. It was fun.
All right.